Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The photograph arrived at the Blue Ridge Historical Society on a Tuesday morning in March of 2023, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age and tucked inside a cardboard box that smelled of attic dust and forgotten memories. Margaret Chin, the Society's lead archivist, had received hundreds of such donations over her 15-year career, most containing faded daguerreotypes of stern-faced ancestors, land deeds from the 1800s, or Civil War correspondence that added small fragments to the ever-expanding mosaic of Appalachian history. This particular donation came from the estate of Dorothy Gaines, a 97-year-old woman who had passed away 3 weeks earlier in a nursing home just outside Asheville, North Carolina, leaving behind no living relatives and a lifetime of accumulated belongings that told the story of 5 generations in the mountains. Margaret's hands moved with practiced care as she lifted the photograph from its protective wrapping, and in that moment, everything about her ordinary Tuesday morning shifted into something altogether different. The image measured 8 inches by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had warped slightly over the decades but remained remarkably intact. The photograph itself was a studio portrait, professionally taken with the formal composition typical of the early 1900s, and it showed a wedding couple posed against a painted backdrop of pastoral scenery that attempted to evoke classical European gardens but succeeded only in looking strangely artificial against the reality of who these people clearly were. The bride stood at the center of the frame, her posture rigid in the manner that long exposure times demanded, but her eyes held something that transcended the technical limitations of early photography. She wore a high-necked wedding gown of white cotton with delicate lace inserts at the collar and sleeves, her dark hair swept up in the Gibson girl style that had been fashionable in the first decade of the 20th century, and in her hands she held a small bouquet of what appeared to be mountain laurel and wild roses, flowers that would have been gathered from the surrounding hills rather than purchased from any florist. The groom stood beside her, one hand resting formally on the back of her chair, dressed in a dark suit that looked new and uncomfortable, his face bearing the weathered complexion of someone who spent his days working outdoors, and his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera lens with an expression that Margaret found difficult to read even after studying it for several long minutes. But it was the bride's face that arrested Margaret's attention and refused to let go. Despite the formal rigidity of the pose, despite the long exposure that should have flattened all expression into bland neutrality, something in this young woman's eyes spoke of barely contained emotion that the camera had somehow managed to capture across more than a century of silence. Her lips were pressed together in what should have been a proper wedding day smile, but the muscles around her mouth betrayed tension, and her eyes, dark and intense even in the sepia tones of aged photography, seemed to be looking not at the camera but through it, toward some future or some fate that she alone could see approaching. Margaret had examined thousands of historical photographs, and she had learned to read the subtle language of posture and expression that people unconsciously revealed even when trying their hardest to present a perfect image, and everything about this bride suggested a woman standing at a crossroads who already knew which path would lead to her destruction but was walking toward it anyway. The back of the photograph's mounting board had been covered with careful handwriting in faded brown ink, and Margaret turned it over to read what someone, presumably from a later generation, had written there. The notation identified the couple as Catherine Rose Murphy and Thomas Edwin Hargrove, married on October 12, 1907, at the Presbyterian Church in Black Mountain, North Carolina, with the ceremony performed by Reverend Samuel Dockery and attended by approximately 40 guests drawn from both families and the surrounding community. The handwriting went on to note that Catherine was 19 years old at the time of her marriage, the eldest daughter of James and Sarah Murphy, who operated a small farm in the Swananoa Valley, and that Thomas was 26, the son of Edwin Hargrove, who owned one of the larger tobacco farms in the region and served as a deacon in the same Presbyterian church where his son was married. Margaret carefully placed the photograph on her examination table under the bright LED lamp she used for detailed archival work, and she reached for her magnifying glass to study the image more closely. The studio mark embossed in the bottom corner identified the photographer as A. J. Whitmore of Black Mountain, and a quick consultation of the Historical Society's records confirmed that Whitmore had operated a photography studio in the town from 1898 until his death in 1921, leaving behind a substantial body of work that documented the people and places of the region during a period of significant change and development. What made this particular photograph unusual was not its technical quality, which was competent but unremarkable for the period, but rather the intensity of emotion it somehow managed to convey despite all the formal constraints of early 20th century portrait photography. As Margaret continued examining the contents of Dorothy Gaines's donation box, she discovered several other items related to the Murphy and Hargrove families, including a family Bible with births and deaths recorded in multiple hands spanning from 1843 to 1962, a small collection of letters tied with ribbon that proved to be correspondence between Catherine and her younger sister Ellen during the years 1908 through 1912, and a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Sarah Murphy, Catherine's mother, covering the years 1905 through 1910. Margaret's pulse quickened as she realized that she was looking at an unusually complete documentary record of a specific family during a specific period, the kind of archival treasure that allowed historians to reconstruct not just dates and events but actual lived experience. The texture and feeling of daily life in the mountains during a time when the old ways of Appalachian culture were beginning to give way to the forces of modernization and change. But it was the last item in the box that transformed everything from interesting historical documentation into something altogether more compelling and tragic. Tucked between the pages of Sarah Murphy's journal, pressed flat and nearly invisible until Margaret began carefully turning each page to check for damage or deterioration, was an envelope addressed in careful feminine handwriting to Mrs. Catherine Rose Hargrove at a street address in Asheville that Margaret recognized as being in the Montford neighborhood, which had been one of the city's more prosperous residential areas during the early decades of the 20th century. The envelope had never been mailed, as evidenced by the absence of any postage or cancellation marks, and when Margaret carefully opened it with conservator's tools designed to minimize damage to fragile paper, she found inside a 3-page letter written in the same hand as the envelope's address, dated November 3, 1909, exactly 2 years and 3 weeks after the wedding photograph had been taken. Margaret began reading, and with each sentence, the story contained in that faded ink grew darker and more desperate, until by the time she reached the final paragraph, she understood that she was holding not just a historical document but a window into a tragedy that had unfolded more than a century ago in these same mountains, involving real people whose suffering had been carefully hidden away and forgotten by subsequent generations who perhaps found the truth too painful or too shameful to preserve. The letter was addressed to Catherine's sister Ellen, who had apparently moved to Knoxville after her own marriage in 1908, and it began with the kind of domestic pleasantries that were conventional in correspondence between sisters, inquiries about health and family and the small details of daily life. But by the second paragraph, the tone shifted dramatically, and Catherine's carefully controlled handwriting began to reveal the desperation underneath. The letter described a marriage that had deteriorated from difficult to unbearable, a husband whose initial courtship charm had given way to violent temper and controlling behavior, and a young woman's growing realization that the life she had imagined for herself on her wedding day bore no resemblance whatsoever to the reality she now inhabited. Catherine wrote of Thomas's drinking, which had been moderate during their courtship but had steadily increased until he rarely went a day without whiskey, and of his rages when the drink took hold of him, rages that had progressed from shouted accusations to thrown objects to, in recent months, his hands around her throat while he cursed her for imagined infidelities and inadequacies. She wrote of her isolation in the large house that Thomas's father had built for them on the Hargrove property, isolated from her own family by both distance and by Thomas's insistence that she limit her visits home because, he claimed, her mother filled her head with dissatisfaction and made her forget her proper duties as a wife. But what made the letter truly extraordinary, what elevated it from a painful but not uncommon story of domestic unhappiness in an era when women had few options for escape, was Catherine's clear and determined statement in the final page that she had consulted with an attorney in Asheville, a progressive lawyer named Robert Caldwell who had gained some regional notoriety for his willingness to represent women seeking divorces on grounds of cruelty and abandonment. Catherine wrote that Caldwell had agreed to take her case, that she had documented Thomas's violence with photographs of bruises and sworn statements from 2 household servants who had witnessed his attacks, and that she intended to file for divorce within the month, knowing full well that such an action would bring scandal upon both her family and the Hargroves, would likely result in her being shunned by much of the community, and would leave her with uncertain financial prospects and a damaged reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life. The letter ended with Catherine asking Ellen to pray for her courage, to understand if the ensuing scandal made it difficult for Ellen to acknowledge their relationship publicly, and to know that whatever happened, Catherine had chosen the possibility of survival and dignity over the certainty of continued degradation and the very real risk that one of Thomas's rages would end with her death. The final line, written in a hand that trembled noticeably from the firmness of the earlier paragraphs, stated simply that Catherine would send word once the papers had been filed and that she hoped Ellen would find it in her heart to offer refuge if Catherine needed to leave the mountains entirely to start her life over somewhere Thomas and his family's influence could not reach her. Margaret sat back in her chair, the letter still in her gloved hands, and felt the weight of the question that now hung over everything in the donation box. What had happened? Had Catherine Murphy Hargrove found the courage to file those divorce papers in November of 1909? Had she escaped the violent marriage she described with such careful, devastating clarity? And if so, why was this letter, which was clearly meant to be sent to her sister in Knoxville, still here, unposted and hidden away in her mother's journal more than a century later? Margaret's training as an archivist had taught her that absence of information could be just as significant as its presence, and the fact that this letter had never been sent suggested something had interrupted Catherine's plans between the writing and the mailing. Margaret turned immediately to her computer and began the research that would consume the next 6 weeks of her life and ultimately lead to discoveries that would challenge everything the local historical community thought they knew about the Murphy and Hargrove families. She started with census records, searching for Catherine Rose Murphy Hargrove in the 1910 census, which would have been enumerated in April of that year, approximately 5 months after the letter had been written. The search returned no results under Catherine's married name, but when Margaret expanded her search parameters, she found Catherine living with her parents in the Swannanoa Valley, listed as Catherine Murphy with no husband present, her marital status ambiguously recorded as married, and her occupation given as none. The absence of Thomas from the household was suggestive but not conclusive, and Margaret continued searching through digitized newspaper archives from Asheville, Black Mountain, and the surrounding communities, looking for any mention of divorce proceedings, legal disputes, or anything else that might shed light on what had happened after Catherine wrote that desperate letter to her sister. 4 days, the search yielded nothing, and Margaret began to wonder if perhaps Catherine had simply changed her mind, if the courage she summoned to write the letter had failed her when the moment came to actually take action, and she had returned to her parents' home temporarily to reconsider her options. But then, on a Friday evening when Margaret was ready to leave work and return to her own small apartment in West Asheville, a search algorithm she had set running in the background returned a hit that made her blood run cold. The Asheville Citizen newspaper, in its edition of November 27, 1909, exactly 24 days after Catherine had dated her unsent letter, carried a brief story under the headline, "Fire Destroys Hargrove Residence, One Fatality Reported." The article, written in the terse, factual style of early 20th century journalism, reported that a fire of unknown origin had broken out in the early morning hours of November 26 at the residence of Thomas E. Hargrove in the Swannanoa Valley, completely destroying the structure and claiming one life. The victim was identified as Mrs. Catherine Hargrove, age 21, wife of Thomas Hargrove. The article noted that Mr. Hargrove had been away from home at the time of the fire, having traveled to Marion on business the previous day, and that the cause of the blaze remained under investigation by local authorities. To understand how Catherine Murphy came to be standing in that photographer's studio in October of 1907, wearing a white dress and holding mountain flowers while her eyes betrayed her mounting dread, it is necessary to go back 3 years earlier, to the summer of 1904, when she was 16 years old and still believed that her life would follow the simple, predictable pattern that had shaped the lives of mountain women for generations. The Swannanoa Valley in those years was still largely rural, though the arrival of the railroad in the previous decade had begun to bring changes that would eventually transform the entire region. Small farms dotted the valley floor and crept partway up the surrounding mountains, families working land that had been cleared and cultivated by their parents and grandparents, growing tobacco and corn and vegetables, raising hogs and cattle, and maintaining the intricate web of kinship and mutual obligation that had always been the foundation of Appalachian society. The Murphy farm consisted of 87 acres of valley bottom and hillside, with approximately 30 acres under cultivation at any given time, and the rest left as woodland that provided timber for building and fuel, forage for livestock, and the wild plants that supplemented the family's diet throughout the year. James Murphy had inherited the land from his father, who had settled in the valley in the 1840s after migrating south from Virginia, and he worked it with the help of his two eldest daughters, Catherine and Ellen, since his only son had died of scarlet fever at age 7, leaving the family without male help at a time when such help was considered essential for a farm's survival. Sarah Murphy managed the household with the efficiency and resourcefulness that mountain women had perfected over generations of making do with limited resources, and she supplemented the farm's income by taking in sewing and by selling butter, eggs, and vegetables to the summer tourists who were beginning to discover the mountains as a retreat from the heat and disease of the lowland cities. Catherine had grown up understanding that education for mountain girls typically ended around the 8th grade, that her future would likely involve marriage to a local boy, children arriving quickly and regularly, and a life of hard work balanced by the deep satisfactions of family and community and the physical beauty of the mountains that surrounded them in every direction. She had attended the one-room schoolhouse in Black Mountain through the 7th grade, where she had distinguished herself as one of the brightest students, particularly gifted in reading and composition, and her teacher, Miss Harriet Vance, had encouraged Sarah Murphy to allow Catherine to continue her education, suggesting that the girl had the potential to perhaps become a teacher herself if she could complete high school and maybe even attend the normal school in Asheville. But the financial realities of farm life made such aspirations difficult to sustain, and by the time Catherine turned 16, her presence was needed at home to help with the younger children, with the garden and the poultry and the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and washing and mending that constituted women's work in a rural household. She accepted this with the resignation of someone who understood that individual dreams often had to bend to family necessity, but she maintained her love of reading, borrowing books whenever she could from the small lending library that the Presbyterian Church maintained, and she filled notebooks with her own writings, poems and observations and short stories that captured the rhythms and textures of mountain life with a sensitivity and precision that would have impressed anyone who had the opportunity to read them. Thomas Hargrove entered Catherine's life in August of 1904 at a church social, one of the regular gatherings where young people from throughout the valley met under the watchful eyes of parents and community elders, where courtships were initiated and evaluated according to careful calculations of family standing, land ownership, religious respectability, and the mysterious alchemy of personal attraction that could not be entirely controlled no matter how carefully the community tried to channel it. Thomas was 23 years old then, recently returned from 2 years working on the railroad construction crews that were pushing lines deeper into the mountains, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew that his family's relative prosperity gave him advantages in the local marriage market. The Hargrove family owned one of the larger farms in the valley, nearly 200 acres of prime bottomland that Edwin Hargrove had gradually assembled through shrewd purchases and strategic marriages, and they had diversified beyond simple subsistence farming into commercial tobacco cultivation, which brought in the kind of cash income that most mountain families never saw. Edwin Hargrove's house was the largest in the valley, a 2-story frame structure with a broad front porch and glass windows in every room, and the family attended church not just regularly but prominently, occupying a front pew and contributing generously to every church function and charitable cause. When Thomas began showing interest in Catherine Murphy that summer, paying attention to her at church socials, arranging to be present when he knew she would be at the general store in Black Mountain, and eventually asking James Murphy's permission to call on her formally at the family farm, it was understood by everyone involved that such a match would represent a significant step up in the world for the Murphy family. Catherine's feelings about Thomas during their courtship period were complex, and not entirely clear even to herself. He was handsome in a conventional way, with regular features and the kind of solid physical presence that came from years of outdoor work and physical labor. He was articulate when he chose to be, capable of discussing topics beyond farming and weather, and he had seen more of the world than most young men in the valley, having traveled as far as Knoxville and Roanoke during his railroad years. He brought her small gifts, a hair ribbon from Asheville, a book of poetry that he claimed to have selected himself, though Catherine suspected his mother had actually chosen it, and he was unfailingly polite to her parents, respectful in a way that demonstrated his understanding of proper courtship protocols. But from the beginning, Catherine sensed something beneath Thomas's courtship performance that troubled her in ways she could not quite articulate. There was a quality of calculation in his attention, as if he were following a script rather than responding to genuine feeling, and she noticed that his charm seemed to have an on-off switch that correlated directly with the presence or absence of an audience. When others were watching, particularly her parents or members of his own family, Thomas was the perfect suitor, attentive and respectful and appropriately romantic. But in the brief moments when they were alone or nearly alone, she sometimes caught glimpses of something colder in his expression, a kind of assessment in his eyes that made her feel more like property being evaluated than a person being courted. She tried to discuss these misgivings with her mother, speaking in careful generalizations rather than direct accusations, suggesting that perhaps she and Thomas did not know each other well enough yet, that perhaps they should extend the courtship period before making any commitment to marriage. But Sarah Murphy, practical and concerned about her daughter's future in ways that transcended any abstract notions of romantic fulfillment, pointed out the realities that Catherine already understood but perhaps did not want to acknowledge. The Murphy farm would not support multiple families, Ellen would also need to be provided for when her time came, and opportunities for women in the mountains remained limited to marriage, teaching if one had the education and the rare opening, or domestic service in the homes of the wealthy summer people who were beginning to build their elaborate retreats in the surrounding hills. Thomas Hargrove represented security, respectability, and the promise of a comfortable life that few mountain girls could expect to achieve. His interest in Catherine was genuine enough, his family approved the match, and whatever private reservations Catherine might have about his character were probably just the normal nervousness that any young woman would feel when contemplating the enormous step of marriage. This was the counsel Sarah offered, mixed with assurances that marriage was always an adjustment, that no man was perfect, and that Catherine would learn to appreciate Thomas's good qualities once they were settled into married life and she had the responsibilities of home and children to occupy her attention. The courtship proceeded according to the expected timeline, and in December of 1906, approximately 2 years after they had met, Thomas formally proposed marriage and Catherine accepted, knowing even as she said yes that something fundamental in her spirit was screaming objections that she was systematically overruling because she could not identify any rational basis for them. The engagement period lasted 10 months, during which time the two families worked together to prepare for the wedding and the couple's subsequent establishment in the new house that Edwin Hargrove was having built on his property, a substantial 4-bedroom structure that represented a level of domestic comfort far beyond what Catherine had known in her parents' more modest farmhouse. The wedding took place as scheduled on October 12, 1907, a cool autumn day when the mountains blazed with fall color and the morning sunlight slanted golden through the windows of the Black Mountain Presbyterian Church. Catherine wore the dress her mother and aunt had spent 3 months sewing. Thomas wore his new suit purchased specially from a men's clothier in Asheville, and 43 guests gathered to witness the ceremony and enjoy the modest reception that followed in the church fellowship hall. Reverend Dockery performed the service using the traditional Episcopal liturgy. Catherine promised to love, honor, and obey Thomas Hargrove, and when the ceremony concluded and the congregation sang the closing hymn, she walked back down the aisle on her new husband's arm, smiling as she was expected to smile while something deep inside her wept for reasons she could not yet name but would come to understand with terrible clarity in the months that followed. The photograph was taken 3 days after the wedding, during a trip to Black Mountain that Thomas had arranged specifically for that purpose, understanding that a proper wedding portrait was one of the markers of social status and family respectability that mattered to his father and to the community at large. Catherine stood in the photographer's studio wearing her wedding dress for the second and final time, the fabric already beginning to feel uncomfortable and foreign to her body, and she tried to compose her face into the expression of joyful serenity that she knew wedding portraits were supposed to capture. But something in her eyes refused to cooperate, something that had seen and understood more in the first 3 days of marriage than she had been willing to acknowledge during 2 years of courtship, and when the camera's shutter opened to capture her image, what it recorded was not joy or even contentment but rather a complex mixture of disappointment, apprehension, and the first stirrings of genuine fear about what her life had become and what it might yet turn into. The house that Edwin Hargrove had built for his son and new daughter-in-law stood at the eastern edge of the Hargrove property, positioned to take advantage of mountain views while remaining close enough to the main house that Thomas's father could maintain the supervision and control that characterized his management of both land and family. The structure was impressive by valley standards, with 4 bedrooms upstairs, a proper parlor and dining room on the main floor, a kitchen with a cast iron stove that represented the latest in domestic technology, and even indoor plumbing that drew water from a spring higher up the mountain through a gravity-fed system that Edwin had engineered himself. For a 19-year-old woman who had grown up in a house where winter cold seeped through every crack and summer heat made sleep nearly impossible, who had shared a bedroom with 3 siblings and known privacy only in snatched moments, this house should have represented luxury and comfort beyond anything she had imagined. But from the first night Catherine spent in that house as Thomas Hargrove's wife, she felt its isolation closing around her like a trap. The nearest neighbor besides Edwin Hargrove himself was more than half a mile away across fields and woodland. The road that passed the property was little more than a wagon track that saw sparse traffic, and Thomas made it clear from the beginning that he expected Catherine to focus her attention on the household and on him, with social visits to her own family limited to occasions when he could accompany her and thus control the nature and duration of the interaction. He explained these restrictions as concern for her safety, suggesting that the roads were dangerous for a woman traveling alone, that her time was better spent establishing their household than gossiping with her mother and sisters, and that part of being married meant creating a new family unit separate from the claims and influences of one's family of origin. Catherine tried to adapt to her new role with the determination and resourcefulness that had characterized her entire life. She threw herself into housekeeping with an energy that bordered on desperation, keeping the floors swept and the windows clean, preparing elaborate meals with the generous food budget that Thomas provided, and attempting to create an atmosphere of domestic harmony that might soften whatever darkness she sensed growing in her husband. But nothing she did seemed to satisfy him. Or perhaps more accurately, his satisfaction lasted only briefly before being replaced by new criticisms and complaints that suggested the problem lay not with any specific failure on her part but rather with some fundamental inadequacy in her very being. The drinking had begun before the wedding, Catherine realized in retrospect. But during courtship Thomas had been careful to keep it hidden or at least minimal enough that it could be dismissed as normal social consumption. After the wedding, freed from the need to maintain appearances before the Murphy family, Thomas began drinking with a regularity and intensity that escalated with alarming speed. He kept whiskey in the house, purchasing it from a source Catherine never identified, and he would begin drinking in the late afternoon after returning from whatever work he had done on his father's farm, continuing through dinner and into the evening until he became first expansive and affectionate, then morose and self-pitying, and finally angry with a rage that seemed to have no specific cause but sought targets wherever it could find them. Catherine became the primary target for this rage. Accused of being ungrateful for the comfortable life Thomas had provided, of being cold and unresponsive to his affections, of being stupid and useless and a disappointment to everyone who had ever placed faith in her. The verbal abuse progressed to physical violence in their 3rd month of marriage, a shove that sent her stumbling against the kitchen table during an argument whose origin she could no longer remember even hours later, followed by Thomas's tearful apologies and promises that it would never happen again, that the whiskey had made him lose control, that he loved her more than life itself and would rather die than see her hurt. Catherine wanted desperately to believe these apologies, and she told herself that the violence was an aberration, that Thomas would recognize what he was becoming and find the strength to stop drinking or at least moderate his consumption. But the violence did not remain aberrant. It became instead a regular feature of their married life, occurring with increasing frequency and intensity throughout the winter and spring of 1908. Thomas would arrive home already drunk, or he would drink through dinner until his eyes took on the glassy focus that Catherine learned to recognize as the warning sign that violence was approaching, and then some small thing would trigger him. The food would be too cold or too hot. The house would be too quiet, or Catherine would be making too much noise as she moved through her evening tasks. And he would explode in fury that manifested sometimes as thrown dishes and sometimes as his hands on her body, slapping and shoving, and, on several occasions that Catherine found herself unable to think about directly, his hands around her throat while he shouted that she was driving him to madness, that she was making him do this, that if she would just be a proper wife he would not have to discipline her this way. The isolation that Thomas had imposed on their household now revealed itself as a deliberate strategy rather than simple concern for her well-being. With no neighbors close enough to hear screams or see bruises, with her contact with her own family carefully limited and monitored, with Thomas's father living just close enough to be aware of any attempt she might make to leave but apparently not close enough or not interested enough to intervene in what he probably considered his son's private domestic affairs, Catherine found herself trapped in a situation from which she could see no clear escape. The social conventions of the time and place worked entirely in Thomas's favor. A wife was expected to submit to her husband's authority. Complaints about marital difficulties were considered shameful admissions of failure, and divorce, while legally possible, carried such enormous social stigma that few women were willing to endure it except in the most extreme circumstances. Catherine tried to maintain contact with her family through letters, carefully worded to avoid revealing the full extent of her misery but attempting to convey some sense that her marriage was not the success everyone had assumed it would be. But Thomas monitored the mail, reading her letters before they were sent and sometimes forbidding her to send them at all if he decided they contained material that was critical of him or likely to cause Sarah Murphy to ask uncomfortable questions. Ellen, who had married a railroad clerk in Knoxville in the summer of 1908 and moved away from the valley, continued to write regularly, and her letters became Catherine's lifeline, the one connection to a world beyond the prison her marriage had become. The turning point came in August of 1909, when Thomas, drunk and enraged over some trivial matter Catherine could no longer recall even days later, beat her badly enough that she could not hide the injuries from the household servants, a married couple named Samuel and Ida Foster who lived in a small cottage on the Hargrove property and who had tried to maintain a careful neutrality regarding what they clearly knew was happening in the main house. Ida Foster, seeing the purple bruises that covered Catherine's arms and the swelling around her left eye, broke the silence she had maintained for more than a year and told Catherine quietly but firmly that this could not continue, that Thomas would eventually kill her if she did not find a way to leave, and that there were lawyers in Asheville who specialized in helping women escape violent marriages if Catherine could find the courage to seek their assistance. The conversation with Ida Foster planted a seed that grew with startling speed through Catherine's consciousness over the following weeks. She began to allow herself to think thoughts that she had previously suppressed as impossible or unworthy. She began to imagine a life beyond this marriage, beyond Thomas's rage and control, beyond the daily fear that had become her constant companion. She began to gather information carefully and secretly, listening to conversations about legal matters when Thomas's family visited, reading newspaper accounts of divorce cases when she could obtain newspapers without arousing suspicion, and gradually formulating a plan that terrified her even as it offered the only hope she could identify for survival. In late September of 1909, during one of the rare trips to Asheville that Thomas permitted, Catherine managed to separate from him for approximately 40 minutes by claiming she needed to visit a millinery shop while he conducted business at the tobacco warehouse. Instead of shopping for hats, she went to the office of Robert Caldwell, the attorney whose name she had learned from a newspaper article about a controversial divorce case involving a prominent Asheville family. Caldwell listened to her story with the careful attention of someone who had heard similar stories many times before, and he told her honestly what she would face if she chose to pursue divorce on grounds of cruelty, the legal challenges, the social consequences, the likelihood that Thomas and his family would fight the proceeding with every resource at their disposal, and the uncertain outcome since judges in North Carolina remained deeply reluctant to grant divorces to women who could not prove extreme and sustained physical violence or complete abandonment. But Caldwell also told her that he believed her case was strong enough to have a reasonable chance of success, that he was willing to represent her, and that if she could document the abuse with photographs of injuries and sworn statements from witnesses, they could file papers that would initiate the legal process and potentially obtain an order of protection that would prohibit Thomas from coming near her while the case was pending. Catherine left Caldwell's office with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, understanding that she had just set in motion events that could not be undone, that would transform her life in ways she could only partially anticipate, and that represented her best and perhaps only chance to escape a marriage that was destroying her spirit and threatening her life. She spent the next 6 weeks gathering the evidence Caldwell had told her would be necessary, asking Ida Foster to photograph her injuries. After particularly violent episodes, obtaining sworn statements from both Ida and Samuel Foster attesting to what they had witnessed, and documenting dates and incidents in a small notebook that she hid in the lining of her winter coat where Thomas would not think to look for it. By the end of October, she had what Caldwell had said would be sufficient evidence to file a compelling case, and she made plans to return to Asheville in early November to formally initiate the divorce proceedings. It was during this period, in the first days of November 1909, that Catherine wrote the letter to her sister Ellen that would eventually find its way into their mother's journal and remain there undelivered for more than a century. She wrote it late at night while Thomas was passed out drunk in their bedroom. She wrote it with the careful precision of someone who understood that she was documenting not just her current situation but creating a record that might be the only testimony to her suffering if something went wrong. She wrote it as an act of courage and an acknowledgement of fear, as a declaration of intent and a plea for understanding, and as a message across time from a young woman who had finally found the strength to say that she deserved better than what her life had become and was willing to risk everything to claim that better life even if the path toward it led through scandal and shame and isolation. She sealed the letter, addressed it to Ellen in Knoxville, and set it on the hall table where she kept outgoing correspondence that would be mailed the next time she or Thomas went to Black Mountain. She went to bed that night with something approaching hope, feeling that she had finally taken the first real step toward reclaiming her life and her future. She had no way of knowing that the letter would never be sent, that within 3 weeks the house where she had suffered so much would be reduced to ashes, and that her story would be buried for more than a century under layers of deliberate forgetting and carefully maintained silence. The fire that destroyed the Hargrove house in the early morning hours of November 26, 1909, began, according to the official investigation conducted by the county sheriff, in the kitchen area and spread with remarkable speed through the structure's wooden frame, consuming the building so completely that by the time neighbors arrived in response to the visible flames, there was nothing to be done except watch the structure collapse in on itself in a shower of sparks that rose toward the dark mountain sky. Thomas Hargrove, who had indeed been in Marion on business as the newspaper reported, returned home later that morning to find nothing but smoking ruins and the news that his wife of 2 years had died in the blaze, her body recovered from what had been their bedroom, burned beyond easy recognition but identified by the gold wedding band still on her finger. The official conclusion of the investigation, delivered 3 weeks later after what the sheriff described as a thorough examination of all available evidence, determined that the fire had been accidental, most likely caused by embers from the kitchen stove igniting nearby combustible material, and that Catherine Hargrove had likely been overcome by smoke while sleeping and had died before the flames reached her. The case was closed with no criminal charges filed. Thomas Hargrove buried his wife in the Presbyterian Church Cemetery with a headstone that described her as a beloved wife taken too soon, and the community moved on as communities do, absorbing this tragedy into the general catalog of misfortunes and accidents that characterized life in the mountains during a period when fires, floods, and diseases still claimed lives with sobering regularity. But for Margaret Chin, reading through documents, more than a century later, with the advantage of historical distance and archival completeness that contemporary observers never possessed, the official story began to unravel under the weight of accumulated details that individually might mean nothing but collectively suggested a very different narrative. She began with the letter itself, the fact that it had never been sent despite Catherine's clear intention to mail it, which meant that something had happened between November 3rd when she wrote it and November 26th when she died. Margaret searched through the newspaper archives for any mention of Catherine's activities during those 3 weeks, finding only a brief social note reporting that Mrs. Thomas Hargrove had attended a Ladies' Aid Society meeting at the Presbyterian Church on November 10th, where she appeared in good health and spirits according to the columnist's conventional phrasing. Margaret then turned her attention to the fire investigation report, which had been preserved in the county archives and which provided more detail than the brief newspaper accounts. The report noted that the fire had been discovered by Samuel Foster, the servant who lived on the property, at approximately 4 in the morning when he was awakened by his wife who had seen flames through their cottage window. Foster had immediately run to the main house and attempted to enter through the front door, but the interior was already engulfed in flames and filled with smoke that made entry impossible. He had shouted Catherine's name repeatedly but received no response, and by the time other neighbors began arriving, the second floor where the bedrooms were located had already begun to collapse. What caught Margaret's attention in the report was a single paragraph that described Foster's statement to the investigating sheriff, in which he mentioned that he had been surprised to find that both the front and back doors of the house were locked from the outside, requiring him to break a window to attempt entry, and that this was unusual because Catherine typically left the back door unlocked to allow him easy access to deliver firewood early in the mornings. The report acknowledged this detail but dismissed it as insignificant, suggesting that Catherine might have been particularly concerned about security that night or that she might have locked the doors before going to bed and Thomas, in his hurry to leave for Marion, had locked them from outside out of habit. But Margaret's historical training made her question this explanation. Why would Thomas lock the doors from the outside if his wife was still inside the house? And if Catherine had locked them from the inside before bed, how had they come to be locked from the outside? Margaret dug deeper, searching for any record of Thomas Hargrove's activities on November 25th, the day before the fire, and found a hotel register from Marion that confirmed he had checked in late in the afternoon, which meant he would have left the Swannanoa Valley sometime around midday. She found train schedules that showed regular service between Black Mountain and Marion, with departures at 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, which meant Thomas had time to lock the house, travel to Black Mountain, and still catch the afternoon train. Margaret's next discovery came from an unexpected source, a diary kept by Harriet Vance, Catherine's former schoolteacher, which had been donated to the Historical Society years earlier and which Margaret had never had occasion to examine in detail. Vance's entry for November 24, 1909, 2 days before the fire, described a visit from Catherine Hargrove that had both surprised and troubled her. Catherine had appeared at the schoolhouse after classes had ended, looking thin and nervous, and had asked if Miss Vance remembered her and whether they might speak privately. Vance had invited her into the schoolhouse, and Catherine had talked for more than an hour, speaking of her unhappy marriage, of her husband's violence, and of her plan to file for divorce in the coming days. She had asked Miss Vance if she might provide a character reference to the court, testifying that Catherine had been a girl of good character and sound judgment, and Vance had agreed, disturbed by what she was hearing but impressed by Catherine's courage in taking action. Most significantly, Catherine had told Vance that she was frightened of what Thomas might do if he discovered her plan before she could file the papers and obtain legal protection, and that she had hidden certain important documents, including a letter to her sister and the evidence she had gathered for her attorney, in her mother's journal because Thomas would never think to look there. She had brought the journal with her to her parents' house during a visit the previous week, claiming she wanted to borrow it to copy some family recipes, and she planned to retrieve it after the divorce papers were filed and she no longer needed to fear Thomas's retaliation. This diary entry provided the explanation for why Catherine's letter had never been sent and had ended up in Sarah Murphy's journal. But it also raised darker questions about the fire and Catherine's death. If Catherine was frightened enough of Thomas that she was hiding evidence at her parents' house, if she believed he might retaliate violently if he discovered her plan, and if she had in fact told him or he had somehow discovered that she intended to file for divorce, then what appeared to be an accidental house fire began to look very much like something else entirely. Margaret knew she needed more evidence before she could responsibly suggest that Catherine Hargrove's death might have been anything other than the tragic accident described in official records. She began searching for any information about Thomas Hargrove's life after his wife's death, and what she found deepened her suspicions considerably. Thomas had remarried less than a year after Catherine's death, taking as his second wife a woman named Margaret Dalton from a prominent Asheville family, and he had lived until 1937, dying at age 56 of complications from liver disease consistent with long-term alcohol abuse. He had no children from either marriage, and his obituary described him as a respected member of the community who had served as a church deacon and had continued to operate the family tobacco farm after his father's death in 1920. But Margaret also found two additional pieces of information that transformed the entire narrative from tragic accident to probable murder. The first came from the records of the North Carolina Superior Court, where she discovered that Robert Caldwell, the attorney Catherine had consulted, had filed a petition for divorce on behalf of Catherine Rose Hargrove on November 24, 1909, the same day Catherine had visited her former teacher. The petition charged Thomas Edwin Hargrove with extreme cruelty and sought dissolution of the marriage, financial support for Catherine, and an immediate order of protection prohibiting Thomas from approaching or communicating with Catherine during the pendency of the proceedings. The court had issued the protection order on November 25, requiring it to be served on Thomas Hargrove at his residence. Records showed that the sheriff's deputy assigned to serve the order had arrived at the Hargrove property on the afternoon of November 25 and had been told by Edwin Hargrove that Thomas had left that morning for Marion on business and would not return for several days. The deputy had left the order with Edwin to give to Thomas upon his return, noting in his report that Mrs. Hargrove had not been present at the house when he arrived, and that the house appeared closed and empty. This meant that Thomas had known about the divorce petition and the protection order at least several hours before the fire that killed his wife, plenty of time to form intent and take action, and plenty of time to establish an alibi by traveling to Marion while ensuring that Catherine could not escape the locked house when the fire he had set began to spread. The second piece of evidence was even more damning: a death certificate for Samuel Foster, the servant who had discovered the fire, which showed that he had died in December 1909, less than a month after Catherine's death, from what was listed as an accidental fall while working on the Hargrove property. Ida Foster, Samuel's wife, had left the valley immediately after her husband's death, and Margaret could find no further records of her life or whereabouts, as if she had deliberately disappeared to avoid whatever fate had claimed her husband. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Samuel Foster was the one person besides Catherine who could testify about the locked doors, about Thomas's violence, and about the circumstances in the house immediately before and after the fire. His death within weeks of Catherine's, officially ruled accidental but occurring under circumstances that raised obvious questions, suggested that someone had wanted to eliminate the most dangerous witness to murder. Margaret compiled her findings into a comprehensive report that challenged more than a century of accepted local history and argued, based on the documentary evidence she had uncovered, that Catherine Rose Murphy Hargrove had not died in an accidental fire but had almost certainly been murdered by her husband Thomas Hargrove in retaliation for her attempt to escape their violent marriage through divorce. She presented her findings to the Blue Ridge Historical Society's board in May of 2023, and the presentation generated immediate controversy, with some board members embracing the new interpretation while others argued that Margaret was overreaching, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that it was inappropriate to accuse a long-dead man of murder without definitive proof. The story attracted media attention throughout North Carolina and eventually nationally, with journalists drawn to the compelling narrative of historical injustice uncovered through archival research, and with Margaret appearing in interviews where she carefully explained both the evidence she had found and the limitations of what could be proven more than a century after the events in question. Some descendants of the Hargrove family objected strenuously to Margaret's conclusions, insisting that Thomas Hargrove had been a respected member of the community and that the fire had been thoroughly investigated and ruled accidental. But other descendants, including a great-grandniece of Catherine Murphy, contacted Margaret to express gratitude that someone had finally told the truth about what their family had always privately believed but had felt powerless to publicly assert. The Historical Society ultimately decided to mount an exhibition centered on Catherine's story, using the wedding portrait, the undelivered letter, and the documents Margaret had uncovered to tell a larger story about domestic violence, women's limited legal options in early 20th century Appalachia, and the way historical narratives are constructed and maintained across generations. The exhibition opened in October of 2023, exactly 116 years after Catherine Murphy married Thomas Hargrove, and it drew visitors from throughout the region and beyond, people who came to look at that haunting wedding photograph and to read Catherine's words describing her suffering and her determination to escape it, and to reflect on how little had changed in fundamental ways despite a century of progress in women's legal rights and social status. Margaret stood in the exhibition hall on opening night, watching visitors move slowly through the displays, pausing to read the texts and study the photographs, and she thought about all the work that had gone into recovering this one woman's story from the silence and forgetting that had buried it for so long. She thought about how many other stories remained buried in attics and archives, waiting for someone with time and training and determination to bring them back into the light. She thought about Catherine Murphy Hargrove, 19 years old and trapped in a marriage that was killing her, finding the courage to take action even though she must have known how dangerous that action would be, writing that letter to her sister with hope that there might be a future beyond the violence, a life she could reclaim and live on her own terms. The wedding portrait hung at the center of the exhibition, enlarged to nearly life-size so that visitors could study every detail of Catherine's face, could see for themselves the complex emotions captured in her eyes, the tension in her mouth, the sense of barely contained dread that the camera had somehow managed to preserve across more than a century. Below the portrait, mounted in a climate-controlled case, lay the letter itself, 3 pages of faded ink on aging paper, Catherine's voice speaking across the decades about suffering and courage and the fundamental human desire for dignity and safety and the chance to live without fear. Margaret had arranged for the final panel of the exhibition to include information about domestic violence resources, phone numbers and websites for local shelters and legal services, statistics about intimate partner violence that showed how Catherine's story, tragic and historical as it was, remained devastatingly relevant in the present day. She wanted visitors to leave the exhibition not just with knowledge about one woman's fate in 1909 but with awareness that the fundamental dynamics Catherine experienced continued to shape women's lives more than a century later, and that the courage Catherine found to seek escape was courage that women still needed to find today, in circumstances that remained frightening and dangerous despite legal protections that had not existed in Catherine's time. The exhibition ran for 6 months and was eventually condensed into a traveling version that would tour historical societies and museums throughout North Carolina and Tennessee, carrying Catherine's story to communities that had their own forgotten histories of women who suffered and survived or failed to survive the violence of men who claimed to love them. Margaret continued her research, finding other stories, other letters, other photographs that documented the texture of women's lives in the mountains during the early 20th century, building an archive that challenged the romantic narratives of Appalachian history and insisted on the complexity and difficulty of real lives lived in real circumstances by people who deserve to be remembered as fully human rather than as picturesque symbols of a simpler past. And in the cemetery of the Black Mountain Presbyterian Church, Catherine Rose Murphy Hargrove remained buried under a headstone that identified her only as a beloved wife, with no mention of the violence she suffered or the courage she found or the justice that was denied her both in life and in death. Margaret visited the grave several times during her research, standing in the quiet mountain morning air and thinking about the young woman whose bones lay beneath the earth, and about all the stories that remained untold, all the silences that had never been broken, all the women whose suffering had been carefully hidden away and forgotten because the truth was too uncomfortable for those who survived them. The wedding portrait that had started everything continued to draw attention wherever it was displayed, and art critics and photography historians began to study it as an example of how early photography could capture psychological and emotional truth despite the technical limitations of the medium. But for Margaret, the power of the photograph had nothing to do with technical achievement and everything to do with Catherine herself, with the young woman who stood before the camera knowing something terrible about her future, unable to articulate it fully even to herself but unable to hide it completely from the lens that captured her image. The photograph became a kind of testimony, evidence not just of what Catherine looked like on those days after her wedding but of what she knew and felt and feared, a message from the past that waited more than a century to be properly read and understood. In the end, Margaret knew she could not prove murder beyond reasonable doubt according to legal standards, could not bring Thomas Hargrove to justice or give Catherine the vindication she had sought when she filed her divorce papers in November of 1909. But Margaret could do what historians do, which is to recover stories that have been lost, to challenge official narratives that erase uncomfortable truths, and to insist that the past was more complex and more painful and more fully human than simplified versions allow. She could give Catherine a voice again, could make sure that her suffering was acknowledged and her courage was recognized, and could ensure that her story would not be forgotten again, would not sink back into the silence from which Margaret had worked so hard to retrieve it. And perhaps that was enough, or if not enough, then at least something, a small act of justice performed across the gulf of time, an acknowledgement that Catherine Murphy Hargrove had lived and suffered and tried to save herself, and that her life mattered, her story mattered, and the truth about what happened to her mattered, even if that truth could never be fully proven or officially acknowledged or made to change the outcome of events that had unfolded more than a century before Margaret opened that cardboard box on an ordinary Tuesday morning and found a photograph of a bride whose eyes told a story that no one had wanted to hear. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.